Hi and welcome everyone. I see we got everyone starting to join now. Terry Moore, welcome. Patrice, Mervyn, lovely to see you online again. I see Barry from the UK, from the Climate Governance Initiative. Lovely to see you online. We are expecting some others to come online fairly shortly. I'm just going to have a look at this quickly. Ralph is just getting his presentation sorted out. It's rather large, so we're just making sure that Ralph can have a look at can show his presentation to us. So if you wouldn't mind holding on a minute while people come online, that'd be lovely.
Carolyn, while we're waiting, it would be great to see everyone who's there.
Yes, we can do that. Let me open. I'm going to raise everyone to the level of a panelist. Then we can introduce, because we don't have a big audience today. And the reason why is that many people are sitting at COP at the moment or on their way to COP. So please accept your invitation to become a panelist. And I think we can have an interactive engagement today. Patrice, if you can hear us, I've just sent you an invitation. You declined. You're welcome to join any way you wish. That's lovely. Okay, so both of you, Terry and Patrice, you're welcome to, we've got Mervyn and Barry online. Thank you very much. So this is going to be a very open and interactive session. It's quite a small session. We are expecting some others to come online, but please, you're welcome to put your videos on, put your cameras on, put your cameras on, put your sound on, and let's have an engaging session. But let's start perhaps with Ralph doing an overview for us of the topic at hand. He has got a presentation. Ralph, will you just share your slides, please? And then also make sure when you share, if you can click that bottom right-hand corner to share the sound as well.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Let me just turn off my video. And I want to just apologize for possible background noise, and also the Wi-Fi here in the lounge is not as well as I was told it would be. So I'm going to just keep my video off. And it's an honor to be here with you, and good to be in contact with you again, Mervyn. Nice to see you again after some years. So I will share the screen here. Just hold on 1 second.
I see Victoria, you've just come online.
Can you see?
It's starting. Yes, we can see your screen. Just
so
not your presentation.
the packets are slide showing.
We see your desktop now.
Is the light?
Yes, there we go.
Oh, that's right.
Lovely, thank you.
So if I click like that, it will go through?
Absolutely, thank you, Ralph.
All right, so yeah, again, great to be here, and I mean it's a more intimate group than I was expecting, and so hopefully we can have a slightly more interactive conversation around this. And many of you, of course, do know a lot about this and have been part of these conversations for many years. So the other thing I just want to mention is that I thought it would be at least a part of an in-person event. And there was a misunderstanding there, so which is why I'm here in this airport lounge. It's not something I would otherwise have preferred to do. So I've been asked to just share a little bit of the kind of material that we share with directors, for example, in our work through the embedding project with directors in partnership with the Institute of Directors. We've been running a series of short workshops, also longer workshops with some of the members. And a lot of the kind of material that I'm talking about today is taken from some of those sessions, but it's also a little bit more, perhaps a bit more focused. The other thing I'd like to mention is that I've just come from a half-day workshop that we've been doing in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban on these issues, on climate change, with something called the Sustainability Professionals Network, which is something we are setting up together with the WWF embedding project, UCT, and the Sustainability Institute. And it's been really encouraging to have these conversations with, these change agents in companies whose job it is really to advance this agenda. And I'm going to show you a slide now to kick off of a game we played, called the Climate Frisk. And it's intentionally confusing, so don't freak out. But this is basically the outcome of the game that we are playing with these professionals as a way to really, in a very short amount of time, give them a good overview of the complexity of the climate change system and climate change problem, moving really from causes on the left-hand side to some of the almost the kind of planetary system cause and effect relationships, radiative forcing, and so on, and the energy budgets, all the way to the right-hand side to the social impacts. So as I say, don't try to make sense of this. Just get a sense of the complexity of this. And what I found really encouraging, especially with some of these sustainability practitioners, is that they've really made use of this opportunity to, not hold back and just ask lots and lots of questions. I find that very refreshing, because this is such a complex field that if we assume we know what's going on, we probably aren't seeing the full picture, right? So, so the kind of first message here is, in the climate space, there's no such thing as a dumb question. And I wanted to start with that perhaps slightly weird statement, because I'm concerned that directors struggle with this issue. In our interactions with directors, there's two, and I'm not putting you in this bucket at all. I'm kind of talking more generally here. We often have this experience that, on the one hand, the knowledge of climate change and implications for business is actually quite low. And in fact, most of them would readily agree with that. And we have survey data to support that assessment. At the same time, they struggle to admit that fact, right? Because they are so used to being, kind of leading voices, people that are looked up to as decision makers, that they find that it's quite difficult to say, this is really complex. It's something I haven't grappled with before, and I'm let me just ask my way through this conversation. And it's something that I think we should foster amongst directors, is to just a kind of a spirit of questioning, rather than perpetuating the sense of kind of being knowledgeable actors that are taking control. Because after all, even the scientists are still grappling with many of the dynamics in the Earth, atmosphere, ocean system. So that's kind of a preface, right? So now, in some ways, that this should be kind of I don't think we necessarily need to go to this now, but and have a conversation about this. But as we go through the rest of the slides, I wanna just kind of invite you to ask yourself, what questions are actually salient to me, right, as we embark on this journey of grappling with climate change, which is becoming so much more topical for all of us. And of course, please feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So please, I will keep a lookout in the chat, but Carolyn, if you could also do that for me and interrupt me if there are any comments or questions, that would be great.
I'll do that.
So, okay, great. So now I've opened the chat and I can't get rid of it here. Let me just close this here. All right. So the first point that I think all of you know, and really I'm going to go through 3 or 4 points that set the scene. And in our interactions with directors, we find it quite important to set the scene in this way. So as I say, it might be not so necessary with this particular group, given that in some ways you're self-selected to be engaging on this. But many directors still think climate change is a problem for the future. They are really not giving, I think, enough attention to the fact that it's already happening and its impacts are severe. Here's just a summary of some of these impacts from the IPCC adaptation working group, the most recent assessment report. And it puts a lot of emphasis on Africa because, as we know, the impacts here are especially severe and communities are especially vulnerable to these impacts. So there's many widespread losses and damages that have been attributed to human-caused climate change. The science of attribution is becoming increasingly sophisticated. And some of those impacts include reduced food production, reduced economic output, loss of biodiversity, and increased human morbidity and mortality. And so I've actually also been quite surprised reading that report, just how significant and quantifiable these existing impacts have already been, right? So as you know, at COP28, the conversation around losses and damages will be very top of mind. And this is really driven because by this realization that we are already experiencing quite profound losses and damages. The second point, which I think, again, this audience doesn't need reminding of, but is also to just explain to directors why 1.5 is such a big deal, right? And so there was a very interesting series in the New York Times, which I found very helpful. I'm just going to use 1 or 2 graphics from that. And it shows that in a 1.5 degrees warming scenario, we would estimate about 14% of the world population to be exposed to extreme heat at least once in 5 years. When we have just that 0.5 degree increment to 2 degrees centigrade, it becomes well over a third, about 37% of the global population. And of course, Africa will have a much higher proportion still because of such a large landmass around the tropics and so on in the desert areas. And just one more example around water scarcity, which of course in South Africa is a huge deal. In a 1.5 scenario, we would expect about 350 million worldwide to be experiencing severe drought, and this is just the urban population. And in 2 degrees centigrade, that's over 60 million more people. So this increment between 1.5 and 2 degrees is really significant, which explains why there's so much emphasis to keeping it within that envelope. And one of the other things about COP28 is that the UN and others have published important stocktake documents. And really, even if we abide by the Paris pledges, the commitments by governments as well as many companies, the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions would actually stay more or less level, right? We need a much more significant downward shift, more or less of the kind of gradient that we experienced during the COVID-19 lockdowns and then to sustain that really for until about 2050, if we want to keep to 1.5 degrees. So it's really the scale of this shift is, I think, a lot more significant than most directors recognize. The good news is that there are diverse and feasible mitigation options. And I think, again, many of you will be aware of this. I'm just going to show 2 or 3 graphs that show some of the important trends here, right? So I think, as many of us know, land use change, the green shifts here, this is again from the IPCC report, is probably the easiest domain to make meaningful reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, halting deforestation, right? So also here in the African context, that is a big opportunity. And then, of course, decarbonizing the electricity sector is front page news many days here in South Africa, but in other parts of the continent, that's not such a big deal because there's such a dearth of electricity. Really, the challenge is to ramp up energy production back in a non-fossil fuel kind of way, right? So these are the 2 most immediate domains where low carbon development is most effective, as it were. And there are some very positive trends in these areas. For example, globally, solar and wind has been steadily increasing as a share of energy production. In fact, together they make up 80% of global power capacity additions last year, especially solar, very radical increase. South Africa has been part of that, but as I think all of us in this room know, that kind of progress has been halting, but hopefully now with more recent commitments and changes, that trajectory is again on the up. And then another example is the EV market, very radical rise in many parts of the world. Again, in South Africa, a very big policy conversation, because not only would we lose an opportunity to join this global trend and thereby reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we would also risk losing export markets for the cars produced in South Africa if they don't also have African markets to EV production in our production facilities. The last one here on the trends picture. This is a picture that shows just how significant prices have dropped also for batteries. And batteries, of course, are a vital aspect of the transition, energy transition. If we rely on wind and solar, we cannot, of course, rely on that as a continuous source. We do need storage facilities, and so batteries play a very important role in that aspect, but also in mobility and other domains. And so the last kind of basic background point I'd like to make is adaptation to climate change needs much more attention. Again, this is a big theme in COP28, but here in South Africa, I think even if you look at the media coverage on climate change, in the public consciousness, and I would dare say even among directors, I think adaptation has not really gained sufficient attention and thinking among directors, right? So I just want to mention an example of the kinds of things that people are doing around the world. Here is many small island states, as you know, are very much at risk and vulnerable to extreme weather events. Like here's, I think it's the Bahamas, affected by hurricanes in the North Atlantic. And they've embarked on a very comprehensive program of protecting their coastline, largely by planting these things. This is a mangrove seedling, and mangroves are very, very effective at protecting coasts from waves and storm surges. So these are also called nature-based adaptation approaches that are really gaining in prominence. And the other advantage of these kinds of responses to climate change is that you can also address the biodiversity and ecosphere integrity crisis, which is also, of course, a major concern around the world and also in South Africa. So this slide just shows how little attention is being given to adaptation in Africa. I mean, South Africa is a bit of an outlier on the continent. We do have a lot of research on adaptation, a lot of it done at our universities, but also by outsiders. But the point is that adaptation does need to be context specific. And so it is a problem that we have so little research on most parts of Africa as to how best to respond to climate change. So those were just some points I wanted to make to set the scene. I'm going to move quite quickly now to 5 or 6 points that we generally try to emphasize to directors. And again, I realize that perhaps the audience in this room is more knowledgeable about this than your average directors. And so I'd also appreciate any feedback as to whether you think some of this is not as necessary as other things, or if you're missing something or things like that. So the first point is, of course, something that the King reports have already put into many directors' consciousness, which is this vital role of effective public disclosures. And in that regard, globally, the expectations and the rules around disclosure are growing really very rapidly. Right? So there's a plethora of disclosure rules around the world. I'm not going to give you any comprehensive overview. I'm just going to mention, for example, here on the left, important developments in the US, which of course has significant broader ramifications given the importance of US supply chains and so on. But here's just a snapshot that tells us how the SEC is developing rules. So they're no longer just proposing rules, they're actually developing these rules to enhance the standardized climate-related disclosures for investors. The TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and we will talk about that in a moment. That reporting is already mandatory for select organizations in New Zealand, Canada, and Hong Kong, Switzerland, and the UK, just as an example. And so, in fact, I had some videos that I was going to show. We created videos for directors together with Nedbank and IODSA, focused on climate change. But given the bandwidth problems here in this airport lounge, I decided to take those out. One of those videos focuses on TCFD, but we will talk about TCFD in a couple of slides' time. So clearly, then, when we then shift to the question of the more substantive dynamics or expectations, and the kinds of things that the disclosure expectations are substantively about, then we need to talk about risks and opportunities. And that is something that the TCFD has really given a lot of attention to. So the top left-hand corner, you see that important report that many people use as the kind of a guide for their governance and strategy making. It's called the Recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's already a couple of years old, but still very influential. So one of the things that report has done is to clarify or propose or suggest a set of categories of risk. One of those, the first category is what they call transition risks, which a lot of them have to do with the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that includes, for example, carbon taxes. That includes also reputation issues. So the summary here refers to shifts in consumer preferences, but I think the Sasol AGM from a few days ago suggests that investors are also developing quite clear preferences on this, and that develops significant risks for companies as well. So Then on the bottom, and I'm sorry that this is a little bit cut off, but it's basically the physical risks. Those are the direct effects in terms of acute risks, as well as more longer-term chronic risks associated with a changing climate. So the acute risks are especially those that are related to the severity of extreme weather events, such as floods or extreme rainfall or hail. I've just come here from Durban, and of course, the memory of the Durban floods is still very fresh in people's minds, and so people are very conscious of the risks associated with flooding and extreme weather events like that. And in Cape Town, of course, we had the day zero drought for 3 or 4 years, very low rainfall, and climate scientists have calculated that the likelihood of that particular drought was at least 3 times higher due to climate change. And so then on the flip side, there are a bunch of opportunities, right? So there's opportunities related to enhancing resource efficiency, which then, of course, can also reduce costs associated with those resources, switching energy sources. I remember working with Woolworths about 15 years ago, and in those days, it was still a challenge to convince the investment committee and the CFO of significant investments in energy efficiency measures, as well as just the early days of putting in some renewable energy. And of course, that argument is so much easier these days, given the rising cost of Eskom energy, the reduced reliability, and the broader climate change and greenhouse gas reduction agenda. So, and then there's a bunch of other things like, the opportunity for products and services, creating new markets. Of course, if you're in the renewable energy industry, you know all about this kind of market opportunity related to climate change. So the next point I wanted to make is exploring scenarios. And the scenarios are basically kind of plausible stories about the future. And scenarios are not necessarily, to be judged on their veracity or facticity or even likelihood. They're really ways for teams of people, and sometimes it could be within an organization, sometimes it could include outsiders, to really think through how the future might unfold. And of course, because of the extremely high uncertainties around many climate change dynamics, there's lots of feedback loops, there's lots of thresholds, there are lots of moving parts in the interactions between climate change policy and infrastructure and economic systems. Scenarios are really just ways to understand possibilities and then, if appropriate, prepare responses to those possibilities. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a very I think, a fairly straightforward, kind of 3-step process of developing scenarios that comes from a book by a colleague of ours in Canada, Nadia Howe. And she had a workshop with us in the embedding project. And I'm really just going to give you 3 kind of key aspects of that process, which I think just illustrate that it doesn't have to be a very sophisticated process, and it could be facilitated quite easily in different kinds of teams, perhaps even among directors. So the first step, and the book that I mentioned is shown in the right bottom hand corner here. The first step is to pose a simple and salient question that's relevant to the focal issue, right? And of course, in this context, we're talking about climate change, and it's important to include a time frame in that question. So just as an example, you might consider a question like, how will climate change affect our energy generation capacity in the next 15 years? This example I took from a workshop I was running with actually energy producers from around Africa at the conference a few months ago. So this was a question that was relevant to them. if you are in agriculture, you might want to rather pose a question around adaptation or impacts on crop production or vulnerabilities and risks and so on, right? So clearly there's a different kinds of questions that are perhaps salient to different kinds of companies and also different points in time. And so the next step is to identify a number, and we say at least 4, it could be more than that, of course, but some of the key driving forces, and then to rate them in terms of both uncertainty and impact. And so, I mean, this is a kind of a pretty standard approach to risk assessment. I think many of you will see that straight away. This is a slightly different way of thinking about driving forces, however. So the next step is to then list these driving forces, come up with a kind of an aggregate score that's the multiple of the uncertainty score and the impact score. So it basically says what issues are particularly impactful, but also particularly uncertain. And those are the issues that need attention in a scenario, because scenarios, are not so much about things that you are pretty clear about. That is the domain of more straightforward strategizing. Scenarios are most useful for those aspects of strategy motion where uncertainty is particularly high. And that is a shift in thinking that I think, especially people that are used to risk management sometimes need a bit of a mind shift. But if you basically then fill out a table like this, and then you go into a 2x2 matrix where you can rank these, you basically situate these scenarios. And in the top right-hand corner, the first scenario is those that are the highest ranking force that impacts you, and then also the second ranking force also impacts you as a company. So both of those forces come together in scenario 1. And basically we're talking about the constellation of driving forces and whether or not they are likely to whether they arise, basically, and they're in that process create a future that you as a company will need to anticipate and respond to. So this is not a crash course in scenario planning, but in the main, I wanted to explain that it's not such a complicated process. This could be done, and we have done this quite fruitfully in a something like an hour-long session, or let's say a 2-hour-long session with quite a diverse kinds groups of people. All right. Then, of course, let me not forget some of the basic aspects here, assessing for carbon footprint. So again, I am assuming that most of the people in this room are aware of some of the basic methodologies. The greenhouse gas protocol is, of course, very well known here as a vital kind of tool to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. What many directors get confused about, though, is that we keep talking about carbon dioxide when there are so many other greenhouse gases. And so part of the issue here is that for the practice of greenhouse gas accounting, we have created a measure called carbon dioxide equivalent, which allows us to consider all of the gases in one measure. And so if carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1, so it's kind of a root index, then these other gases can be compared to carbon dioxide in terms of their contribution to the greenhouse effect. So methane is almost 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And then we have some that are incredibly powerful. So the HFCs and other fluorocarbons are incredibly powerful and have a very high global warming potential. So you don't need a lot of total emissions of these particular gases to actually contribute a lot of CO2 equivalent. Okay, so once that is, out of the way, then you can talk about the scopes. And so the one that I think many of us are very conscious of in South Africa is actually scope 2, which means what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the electricity that we purchase. And it's not just electricity, it's also if we are purchasing heating or even cooling for own use. But for us, really, it's electricity that is most important here. And it's important in South Africa, especially because about at least 90% of our electricity is produced through coal, and actually has very intense greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. Scope 1 are the direct emissions from your company's facilities, including your company's vehicles. And of course, they are particularly front of mind for companies like Sasol that have large industrial complexes. I mean, Sasol is famous for having one of the most largest point sources of greenhouse gas emissions at Secunda. So these are scope 1 and scope 2, and where the complexity becomes then often more concerning for people is what we call scope 3, which is really those greenhouse gas emissions associated with the value chain upstream. So those include the purchased goods and services, and that, for example, includes if you the services you get from airlines when you fly around your employees. And then it also includes scope 3 downstream, which is how your products, for example, how they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions when they are used. And of course, for coal companies, coal producers, that is a very significant aspect of their total emissions. So then there's a fairly well established, kind of it's almost professionalizing process going on in making these kinds of assessments. Also, life cycle assessments of products has been advancing very much in the last few years around the total greenhouse gas emission footprint. So I'm almost done. Another very key point for you to oversee as directors is to articulate a credible public position. And so what do we mean by a credible public position? It's a short and succinct statement to the public that explains the issue, not for an academic audience, for a general audience in a very short, succinct way, to link that issue to your strategy, and then to clarify your commitments in addressing that issue. And sometimes it might even include some of the high-level goals that you have set yourself for your company. So we actually have guidance on this in the embedding project. There's a document that's specifically about position statements, and there's also a kind of guide to emerging trends in what these position statements look like. We also have a database of position statements on our websites, but I'm not going to go into any detail on that. I wanted to mention one example, which is quite a nice illustration, really. I mean, Unilever is known for quite a proactive approach on some of these issues. They have a to Z listing of material issues that they have public positions on. And I'm going to just show you the climate change position statement. You can see it's quite short and sweet, although I think I might go a couple of lines beyond this. And then, of course, this creates the foundation then for the goals that they have published. And I will get to that next, which is point 10, setting credible and ambitious goals. And the key initiative here that we want directors to know about is this initiative called Science-Based Targets. And it helps companies set targets that are not just, kind of convenient on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also unhelpful if they are wildly ambitious and totally unrealistic, right? So they have to be credible, but they have what the Science-Based Targets Initiative is trying to do is to say the targets need to be appropriate and need to correspond to the broader ambition of reaching 1.5 degree warming by 2050. So that trajectory that I spoke about earlier, that is what each company should contribute to, and this is what the SBTs are really all about. So this website gives a lot more information, and I'm assuming that also some of your colleagues in your companies, in the sustainability departments, if you have one, they will hopefully know about this and to use the science-based target initiative climate. There is, by the way, a kind of sister organization that is doing the same thing on biodiversity. All right, so the point about targets is that, of course, we are trying to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And many directors are also a bit confused about what that means. But in essence, it means that the emissions by a company are, in a sense, offset by the greenhouse gases that are removed or at least reduced through things like afforestation or kind of offsets in other kind of sectors. Of course, carbon capture and storage is a technology that many people are hoping will be a very important aspect on the right-hand side. But of course, the large carbon capture and storage plant was recently opened in the United States, but it's very early days to see how significant that actually will be. And here are just some companies that have made commitments to net zero by 2050. What's interesting is even large petrochemical companies like Shell, or large mining companies like BHP have made that commitment. And the leadership kind of boundary, so to speak, is for many companies is net zero carbon by 2040. That is the climate pledge, an important initiative. This extract will throw in some wild. Quite a few companies have added themselves to this climate pledge. Woolworths is an example of a company in South Africa that has done that. So another example is Yulu. The top left hand, one of the main goals that they have is net zero emissions, not just in scopes 1 and 2, but even across their value chain, which is an incredibly significant and quite ambitious target on their behalf. All right, let me finish off. The last point I make here is to take action where each company has leverage. So climate action will look different in different sectors and for different companies. So I just want to mention two examples from our embedding project members. One of them is Emirates Global Aluminium. It's this aluminium plant is just down the road from Dubai, where they are sitting for COP, and it's just unbelievable how much greenhouse gas emissions this company has because of the energy intensity of aluminium smelting. So in that context, what's really amazing is that the CEO has committed the company to net zero by 2050, and it's intriguing how a company like this reached net zero, and they have innovated, and they've also realized that they have a competitive advantage in producing aluminium, and of course that has to do with the very high degrees of insulation in that part of the world, and harness sun energy for producing aluminium. Very quickly, another example here in South Africa on the education side is they had this challenge already about 12, 13 years ago, where they had these weather extremes that created insured losses for many of their clients. And they realized that they could not do anything about the climate change that was driving these events, but they could do things about what they came to call proximate risk drivers. So one of my colleagues, Clifford Sheeran, who was working on it at the time, he had this mantra. He said, it's not about the rain, it's about the drains. And likewise, on the fire side, it's the power, it's the capacity of the fire departments, right? So Santam established a program to work with municipalities to enhance the capacity so that they would be on-site quicker and be more effective, so that Santam insured customers, but also the public, right? Even especially in the townships and so on, would benefit from having less exposure. So that's it. I've got these 11 points. The first four were really just kind of setting the scene, and the subsequent set of 6 points are really a summary of what we believe is expected of directors, in particular in their oversight, to ensure that companies do as they prove themselves to be diligent and responsible in the face of climate change. So there is a guide also of the embedding project on climate change and climate risk oversight. Goes into some of this in a bit more detail. There are some additional questions. I'm not going to go through this due to time, but it's kind of the usual kind of diligence questions that we would expect directors to ask. There's a website here where a lot of this stuff is developed in more detail. I can send you slides, right? The website is on the bottom there. And then, of course, we very much welcome any questions or comments as whatever might be useful. So I'm going to stop maybe on this slide here, and then over back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you very much. As Langton said on the comments, incredibly insightful. And I think, you know, the fact that you brought it to what companies are doing and how we can commit to certain targets as directors is really quite important. So thank you very much for that, Ralph. If you wouldn't mind, stop sharing and then put your camera on, that would be lovely. Anyone that's as an attendee, we'd love to welcome you to join this discussion. I'm going to promote you as a panelist if you've joined recently. I see that some people have declined joining the discussion, but if you would like to join the discussion, we would love to have you online. I think in terms of the activities, what would you say in terms of the next board meetings early next year? If an organization has already looked at climate, looked at various aspects of that, what is the difference that boards can make in moving forward in its first board meeting of 2024? What is the big step forward do you think boards can make?
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Again, apologies about the bandwidth in this lounge, so I've switched off my camera just to make sure that I can be heard.
Sure.
So one of the things that we've also learned is that different companies are very different places in this, and different boards are in very different places in this conversation. So I would be very cautious to give a kind of a straightforward answer to your question, because I mean the simple answer to that question is it really depends how much the board has already talked about this, and you know, so I think if let's say I mean, some companies, they have already had a lot of conversations about this, and so the next board meeting in 2024 will have a pretty clear agenda given those previous conversations. Those kinds of boards will be looking at what's happening at COP28. They will see what comes of those conversations. And they will then, you know, basically also ask their sustainability professionals in their company for, you know, a careful briefing of what, you know, the implications of COP28 for them would mean. You know, so part of that is that companies like that probably already have a system of greenhouse gas accounting, and they basically need to, well, the key issue then for them would be to see, are they on track? Are they on track to reach the goals that they have set? right? That's on the one end of the spectrum, and that's on the mitigation side. On the adaptation side, that board would need to realize that climate change is happening much faster than anticipated, even amongst scientists. And so whatever they thought they would need to do to adapt to climate change, they're going to have to double the speed of those investments in adaptation. And of course, if you're an insurance company, that is particularly important. But also, if you have any involvement in agriculture, be it in your own company or in your supply chain, you will want to give very careful attention to the changes in the prognoses that scientists are making of changes in the next 2 to 5 years. That's for companies that are advanced. For companies that are only really setting out on this journey, well, they really have to take some of these steps that we spoke about today. They need to start to think about their own position statements. They need to set goals and go through some of these steps that we're talking about, and it'll involve, I think, also admitting that most directors probably don't know a lot about this stuff, and they might just need to do something or other to upskill themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone has any questions, please either put it in the chat or raise your hands. We'd love to hear your questions. Ralph, just summarizing from what you're saying, GHG accounting, it sounds like it's a must. So if an organization doesn't have, they're not accounting yet for their greenhouse gas emissions, they need to start doing that. It sounds like it's a basic. Then the second one is the setting of goals and targets. Those metrics and targets seem to be quite important. So once you are able to account for it, you're able to then set your targets. So if you can't track it and monitor it, setting targets becomes a hopeless task. So accounting, then setting your metrics, and then those who have already done that, I'm hearing you say this is happening faster than anyone expected. So let's revisit those targets in the new year to see if we can't expedite the achievement, either expedite the achievement of those targets or set even higher, more audacious targets, so to speak. And then finally, I think importantly, what you're saying is feedback from COP28. What are the nation states talking about? What are they committing to, even if they're reneging on those commitments? What are they committing to? Because certainly what they're committing to is something that's been motivated very strongly for. So to see if those commitments, as you say, we're having to redouble down on our efforts to achieve those targets. Dr. Langton, I see you online. Thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to see you. Do you have any specific questions for Ralph on these matters?
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thanks to the presenter. Very insightful, presentation.
Unfortunately, Dr. Langton, there we go. Yeah, you're back.
Responsibilities and remits. Okay. I'm saying very insightful presentation, and thanks so much. I really captured the whole responsibilities and the remit of boards on matters of disclosure, and that boards have a leadership role in ensuring that this whole reporting, framework, reporting procedures are adhered to. So there is a whole top level function of the board, and it's not exclusive to executives. There is a very clear-cut responsibility and leadership obligation of the board. I did capture that very well, and I think it's very, very important. Quite often we look at these issues and we think, the buck stops with executives and boards continue with their mundane and traditional responsibilities. And thanks so much for highlighting those issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Langton. Prof. King, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask Ralph that it's very important that the board collective mind is focused on things, and you can only do that by making sure you've got agenda items. With the mind, there's a report prepared by management, and the board actually discusses it and comes to a collective conclusion. So, for example, I think there should be on every agenda today the risks and opportunities of climate change to the company, because not only do you have, whenever there's a risk, there's an opportunity. And companies the board needs to understand this in making business judgment calls down the line. So that's number one. The second agenda item, which I think every board should have on there, is supply chain monitoring. Because it's all very well the board of the ultimate consumer listed on the London Stock Exchange doing its GHG accounting, and et cetera, everything we've been talking about. But its main supplier or service provider in the supply chain is running its business on a basis which is actually further degrading the economy and adding to the challenge of climate change. So I think an ultimate consumer has, especially a big company listed on a big stock exchange, has a duty to have this as an agenda item and to monitor what's happening, to get a total picture. Because it's all very well that the company, you can measure the company because it's doing an accounting on GHG, et cetera, but what is happening in that supply chain could even be more adverse to the question of climate change. And then for the company to continue to be seen as a responsible corporate citizen, if it is dealing in a product which is, for example, oil, it's got to have a just transition, and it's got to have a long-term plan to transition out of oil and into renewables. So many of the big oil companies today have as their purpose, when asked what their purpose is to be a long-term supply of energy in a sustainable manner. Now, to move from oil to renewables takes time, it takes money. If you take a company like Sasol in South Africa, or let's take Shell in the EU, it's one of the best shares held by pension funds in the EU are Shell shares. Why? Because first of all, they've had capital appreciation because of the increase in the share price. But more importantly, Shell has continuously paid a dividend, which has paid the pensioners their pensions. But some pension funds have become so big that they actually are the underwriters to IPOs on the CAC, or the London Stock Exchange. So you cannot, in the interests of society and in the interests of the economy, just as the placards of radicals at tennis matches carry around, stop oil. You cannot. But you've got to have to, for the perception of your stakeholder that your company is a responsible corporate citizen, have a just transition plan to move from closing those taps to renewables. And you've got to deal with that publicly and speak about it in your stakeholder relationships. So I think the chairman always should be the person who makes sure that the agenda has vital issues on it for making long-term decisions for the best health of the company, the long-term best interest of the health of the company. And I've just suggested a few. I can carry on. But once you apply your mind to these things, you can actually change the agendas that we've known for the last 40, 50 years. But to meet, for example, the points you've made, Ralph, in your 6 or 10 points, I can't remember, that board should consider. But you actually direct the mind, excuse me, when you have those agenda items. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. King. Maybe just to summarize, so that, as you say, apply your mind to change the thinking of the agenda, that the same agenda that we've had over 50 years. Look at risks and opportunities, supply chain, and corporate citizenship. Ralph, would you like to respond to that?
So thanks very much, Mervyn. I mean, I think what you said chimes very well with what I tried to say, right? So your emphasis on the supply chain, for example, that is core to what we call Scope 3 emissions. And so that's on the mitigation side in terms of greenhouse gas accounting and so on. But what you say about supply chain due diligence is also extremely important on the adaptation side. And so another example that I like to talk to students about and elsewhere is, for example, Woolworth's concern and Marks and Spencer's concern with fresh produce producers in South Africa. And they are under threat because of climate change and drought. And so they've invested quite a lot of resources in trying to understand that risk, but then also to respond to that risk. For example, and this is one of the things that Woolworths does together with WWF, cutting down alien invasive trees in the catchments that reduce water supply to those fresh produce farmers. So I think the point you make about supply chain is very important, well taken, and I just would, kind of underscore that and support that point. And many of the other things as well, I think, chime very well with what I tried to say earlier. So in the interest of time, Rosalind, back to you.
Thank you, Rolf. Just to say, thank you, Rolf. Prof. King is one of the Chapter Zero Southern Africa patrons, so thank you very much for participating today. I see.
Can I just say, Carol, to interrupt you, Ralph, just one thing that my experience is that market forces in the marketplace has a greater impact and effect than legislation or rules. So where you have an ultimate consumer listed on the New York Stock Exchange, let's move continents, and they've got a strict, as a good corporate citizen, to make sure that their suppliers are adhering to a governance model, which is taking account of climate change. It's much more effective on that supplier company than a rule or a legislation, because that's their customers saying to them, do this, otherwise you're not going to be my supplier anymore. And it's much more impactful. So when the ultimate consumer actually starts monitoring what's happening in the supply chain, it's much more effective than rules and regulations that could come out of COP28, for example.
Sorry, yes, voting with your feet. Mark, you have your hand up?
Yes, so I can't put on my video because Ralph or you have chosen not me to be in and that's fine. I would probably take the same view. So my video has been disabled by either you, Karen, or Ralph,
No,
but that's okay.
It hasn't. You should be able to turn it on. Let me just look at the 3 dots. Ask to start video. There we go. You should be able to turn the video on.
Okay, super. So firstly, Ralph, really a great presentation. And the critical thing from Chapter Zero's point of view, what our mandate is to conscientize, educate, and immerse our business leaders in understanding all of these issues and the importance of addressing them. The reason we are able to impose on them is because of Mervyn's work over 30 years, which has changed the power dynamics in the way corporates are run and has enabled us to now be talking to the business leaders. And Mervyn, your idea, of course, of putting it into the agenda and driving it from there. The challenge we face as Chapter Zero Southern Africa is always the same. The attendees that we're going to be having on our events, in a sense, will be those who have crossed the line, understand the importance, and are looking to how they can capacitate themselves and their businesses. And there will be many, many more of them. The world is doing a wonderful job of making it something which is important. But the ones we want to target, and I just wanted your thoughts on this, Ralph, are those business entities, and some of them are very substantial, who have still taken the view that climate change is not an issue that they need to engage in. They're still focused on the bottom line of business. And so the challenge of Chapter Zero is how do we engage with those organizations and those business leaders? I mean, the obvious ones, of course, are the SOEs. But apart from that, within the private sector, you've got the early adopters, which you spoke about, who are engaging with this, and they see it as a growth strategy. And Mervyn, as you said, they are already engaged with saying, what are the risks and opportunities? But the question is, how do we create a provocation for those who are not the adopters, and how we take that further forward? So, Ralph, just asking you, based on your experience, how do we engage with those who have not embraced it, who may be hostile to it?
Thanks, Mark. I will give a quick response, but then perhaps others in the room are actually in a better position, given their experience on many diverse corporate boards. So I'll give you two responses. The first builds on what Mervyn was saying and the crucial role of the chairman or chairperson, because you're quite likely to have scenarios where there are some people on the board that are at least open to this conversation, and then others that are much less so inclined. And so really it makes a huge difference then whether which way the chair is going to swing, so to speak, because we do see a lot of that dynamics on boards do play an important role, where some of those that want to discuss climate change are sidelined by others. And so parts of the conversation could be around recognizing diversity on boards and trying to home in on the role of chairs and how they might be supported. Perhaps also giving them more confidence to push back on those that are, let's say, a little bit more kind of obstructive, perhaps, in the climate change debate. That's the first point. The second point is, I think also, you mentioned Mervyn's work with the King Committee and so on. I think one of the reasons that has been so influential is that there was an effective partnership with the Institute of Directors. And so we are lucky, I think, to have something like the Institute of Directors. It has a lot of directors on its database. And so we have been having these training sessions with directors, and it's via the Institute database where those offerings are made available and marketed and so on. And I think there could be a powerful partnership between Chapter Zero and the Institute that they would probably also be open to, if there's a mutual benefit.
Mm. Thanks, Ralph. And just to say that
can I just add, sorry, Kerry, can I just add some, Mark, to your point? that for years we've been talking about diversity on boards, and it's been racial and gender. That's been the focus. But intergenerational diversity has become absolutely critical. And if you look at an issue of climate change, if you have a board that all of them look like me, well, you've got a disaster on your hands unless you are a person like me that thinks about these things. But if you have male, pale, stale directors on your board, you're not going to have that thinking that Mark is talking about. You're not going to have that chairman that's actually going to direct and steer the board in the correct fashion. So intergenerational diversity is a critical issue on your board. That you have not only male and females on your board and a racial mix, but you've got to have that intergenerational mix. You've got to have millennials on your board. Now, to have Generation Z on your board, 9 out of 10 boards are going to say, but they 23 years and younger, they've had no experience in life and business experience. But many companies now are developing shadow boards. And I've advised companies on that. It's you enter into a contract with a 23-year-old that's done a BSc at Wits University and is very aware of GHG emissions, etc., etc. And he enters into a contract of a non-disclosure agreement and also agrees to good faith, and you have the relevant clauses in that. Register his name with the IRD SA so that if he breaches those good faith clauses and non-disclosure clauses, because otherwise you will start having insider trading, he'll never be appointed a director as he gets older. But when you have an issue in the board, and I've had this experience as advisors to companies, you've got your millennials and they add to this discussion much more than if you don't have them on the board. But then to get ready to pass that test of, did you have all the information when you made that business judgment call? You can go to AI and ask ChatGPT for an answer. But then you go to your shadow board or your advisory committee, whatever you want to call it, made up of Generation Z people, and you put the issue to them and see what they say. And I tell you, 7 times out of 10, you get a light bulb moment. And it comes back to the board, and you discuss it again. So you have this intergenerational input into your business judgment call. And the business judgment rule is there to protect the director, because it was accepted 60 years ago that it's actually unfair and inequitable for a person spent 40 years building a reputation, and he's got a good reputation, he's an experienced director, and you make him a non-executive director. Him and his colleagues in the board apply their minds and they make a business judgment call, which 4 years later turns out to be harmful to the company. Well, the company's got an action for damages against them. Now, completely inequitable, and so the business judgment rule was developed, and there are 3 criteria. That did the board have all the facts before them, objectively speaking, and that they could have garnered and gathered. Well, I'm saying to boards these days, you've got to look at what technical tools, AI tools are available, and you've got to have an intergenerational advisory committee there. You've got to get that intergenerational input. Otherwise, I don't think you can pass the one criteria to say, objectively speaking, I had all the facts and input that I could have got before me. That's number one. And number 2, you had no financial interest in the matter. And then it's got to be a rational business decision at that time in those circumstances. Now, rational was easy until we ran into problems at the beginning of this century when we knew that companies were using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating, climate was changing, etc., etc. It's got to be rational in the context of all those things that are happening. So that a director's got to be very careful today in saying, well, yes, I've got to take risk for reward for the company, but let me test this decision on those three criteria of the director to be protected if it turns out to be wrong. And I've got many corporate scars on my body that I've been party to making wrong business judgment call, and then suddenly you find 2 years later you find it's wrong and you've got to correct it. But today, what's a rational business decision is a more complex question. And when looking with the wisdom of hindsight backwards, you'll say maybe that the board made a mistake. So one's got to be very careful in regard to issues like climate change and all the other issues we're facing today.
Thank you very much, Prof. King. I think that's wise counsel for us here on the call. And of course, this has been recorded so we can get that for others as well. So thank you very much for that. And just to say, we are entering into an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the Institute of Directors in South Africa to be able to provide these webinars and events to the IOD directors. So that will bring in the directors of the IOD having access to all of these events. So I think that's also important. And, you know, to bring in this kind of counsel is critical. You know, that intergenerational thinking, etc. Langton, I see that you had your hand up.
Yeah, sure, Kathleen. Thank you very much. And thanks to Mervyn for quite some wise counsel that comes handy. And there's something before I do make my point, maybe question. The issue of the intergenerational
Diversity. Mm-hmm. Dr. Langton?
No.
Sorry, Dr. Langton, if you could just repeat that. We lost you for a minute.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Issue being received, even the advisory committees that do capture, that do include views and perspectives of the millennials. How well is it being received, and how can we make it a best practice, you know, for modern boards? Then the other question, this question goes to Ralph, and Mark did touch on that. The issue of mobilization, how any experiences of how to achieve the best mobilization, you know, output, especially on the very of corporates that we want to target on emissions. How can we, you know, put in place effective mobilization, you know, strategies? I'm sitting in Zimbabwe. I sit in the corporate space in Zim, and we currently assist on how we can provide an alternative, effective way of mobilizing corporates, including the listed corporates. The Institute of Directors, how can we make them, you know, effective? How can we empower them such that they are able to hold boards, you know, accountable in a very, very meaningful sense, without selective application of you know, rules. What are your experiences around this? And I'm really following this with keen interest, because we're putting together some program that we really want to bring to Zimbabwe, such that we can light the torch, we can light the bulb in the Zimbabwean corporates. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Langton. Perhaps we can take that on offline. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is around the professionalization of being a director, to Prof. King's point, where we can hold directors accountable as a profession, accountable to principles more than through rules of engagement, for example. Prof. King, if you would like to comment, that's fine. Otherwise, we can take it offline in a separate session.
Just very quickly, I happen to be one of the governors at the IOD on the question of the chartered director. And if something happens and he does something which is in the view of our two colleagues and me, we're entitled to remove his status as a chartered director. And so there's already accountability, and there's already, or we can suspend his appointment for 3 years or 5 years, whatever it is. So there is already accountability in that sense. To become a chartered director is you've got to pass some tests, and you've got to pass an examination, and you pass an oral test where I and my other colleagues ask questions. And we wait and see the answers, and then we give the status of chartered director. But if a Mr. X or Mrs. X does something which is untoward from a corporate point of view, we can remove that status. So there's already that accountability.
Thank you, Prof. King. We've really come to the end of our session. So I'd really like to thank Ralph and Prof. King, Dr. Langton, Mark, everyone online. Thank you very much for your participation. Ralph, thank you very much for a very, very insightful presentation. We will make the recording available, and if you can make the slides available, that would help us as well, so people can read along essentially as they're watching the recording as well. Ralph, are there any last words you'd like to leave people with? And you're on mute if you're trying to talk. No, I think Ralph's probably really battling with connectivity where he is. And again, our sincere apologies for not being able to host this event in person, and he has dropped off. So thank you very much for everyone participating, and we will make the recording and the presentation available. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.